Our modern era reached its first peak in the fast-moving 20s. Telegraphy, the telephone, motion picture films and the gramophone had already become part of everyday life. Radio had just emerged on the scene too, and people also wanted to see pictures transmitted along with sound. The decisive idea for the transmission of pictures came from Paul Nipkow. Born in Pomerania in 1860, he developed the legendary Nipkow disc. Christmas Eve, 1883. A young student, alone in Berlin, Nipkow was missing his family. He'd have loved to have seen his mother and wished desperately that there was a way of transmitting a picture of her just like the telephone transmitted her voice. Nipkow then developed the foundations for a simple mechanism later named after him, the Nipkow disc. In 1884, Nipkow was granted an imperial patent for his invention, the first ever patent in the history of television. But at that time, the technical prerequisites for its implementation were lacking. Only when the electron tube was invented could Nipkow's scanning disc be put into practice. Scottish inventor John Logie Baird worked out that picture transmission could only be achieved through two Nipkow scanning discs rotating at the same speed. He laboriously built his primitive setup from bits of scrap. As early as 1923, he applied for a patent for a mechanical television system that utilized Nipkow's scanning disc. But with no practical success to show for his efforts, Baird was unable to find a sponsor for his ideas. Britain's young electrical industry had a low opinion of his television. Baird was leading a humble life in a small attic flat in London. He'd terminated his studies at Glasgow University without graduating. Now, aged 35 and in poor health, Baird had spent years working on his invention, often through the night. He earned a meagre livelihood with casual jobs. Born in Glasgow in 1888, the youngest of 4 children, even as a boy, Baird was fascinated by photography and by the new telephone in his parents' house. Baird continued his experiments in his flat. He desperately needed some kind of success. On this particular morning in 1924, he was about to achieve it through the first ever picture transmission. Baird's subject was a Maltese cross. A beam of light projected an image of it onto the scanning disc with its small holes arranged in a spiral. Behind the disc was a photoelectric cell which converted the light variations into electrical impulses. The signals passed through an amplifier and fed a neon gas discharge lamp. The flickering lamp emitted its light through an identical punch disc on the receiver side. There, the picture was built up again line by line with each revolution. The two identical discs had to rotate at exactly the same speed, but it was this aspect in particular that caused Baird major problems. In the end, however, he was able to synchronize the speed of the two discs through electrical signals. The image of the Maltese cross can be recognized fairly clearly. John Logie Baird thus became the first scientist to put Nipkow's ideas into practice. The age of television had begun. These are original pictures which Baird had stored on old wax records with a technique he also patented. With the help of computer technology, an English amateur scientist succeeded in reconstructing the pictures. In the early years of television, Nipkow's scanning disc was the most important component. The small holes arranged in a spiral broke down a picture line by line and projected the points of light onto a photoelectric cell located behind it. The cell converted the light impulses into electrical voltages which corresponded to the varying degrees of brightness in the picture. In the early years of television, it was mainly films that were scanned. Because of the blurred, unsatisfactory nature of picture transmission, the films had to be shortened and re-edited. This meant that a film suitable for television transmission consisted solely of close-ups. Baird's breakthrough meant that he could at last find sponsors for his idea. His first television, the televisor, appeared on the market in 1928. Broadcasting exhibitions served to introduce the general public to new developments, like the miracle of television. In 1928, at the 5th German Broadcasting Exhibition, Deneš Mihai from Hungary and Professor August Carolus from Germany demonstrated the transmission of simple objects as shadow images, like a pair of scissors, for example. The initial 30 lines soon became 48 and then 90. But with mechanical television, each increase in the number of scanning elements called for bigger discs that rotated at a higher speed, so this technique soon reached its limits. In 1897, German physicist and Nobel Prize winner Carl Ferdinand Braun invented the cathode ray tube, which even today is still the basic element of most TV cameras and receivers. In 1923, an American of Russian extraction, Vladimir Zworykin, used Braun's invention to develop the iconoscope camera tube, a forerunner of the modern television camera. With it, Zworykin achieved the breakthrough to modern, fully electronic television technology. 12 months later, he obtained a patent for a tube for image reproduction. In the picture tube, electromagnets guide a beam of electrons over a screen horizontally and vertically. Lots of individual spots of light appear on the phosphor-coated screen. The brightness of each spot of light depends on the strength of the electron beam. The original picture is formed from the spots line by line. The opposite principle in the camera. Here, the reflected light is focused by a lens and projected onto the photoelectric plate of the electron tube. There, the photoelectric cells are scanned line by a beam of electrons. The beam converts the light and dark shades of the object into electrical impulses. The signals are transmitted by radio or cable. An aerial feeds them to the television receiver. One beam of electrons scans the picture, the other reproduces it synchronously 25 times a second. The human eye thus has the illusion of continuous movement. While television pioneers Mihai and Carolus were working on the further development of mechanical television, a young inventor called Manfred von Ardenne was experimenting with an electronic television tube. In 1931, at the Broadcasting Exhibition in Berlin, together with the Loewe Company, he astounded the general public with the first ever electronic transmission of pictures. The era of mechanical television was coming to a close. As early as 1932, electronic television also became established in the United States. The first home receivers were manufactured in large numbers at an early stage, but because of the high price and the meager choice of programs, they remained unattractive for private customers. In Germany in 1935, a TV program was transmitted 3 evenings a week. For the live broadcasts, artists had to sit in a small, dark cabin where they were scanned through a little window by a beam of light. In these cabins, it was only possible to transmit upper body pictures. At first, the broadcasts could only be seen in a few public viewing rooms. In 1936, the newly formed television station, Paul Nipkow, broadcast pictures from the Olympic Games in Berlin. For the Telefunken concern, a young engineer called Walter Bruch built his famous television gun, the first fully electronic camera with an iconoscope. The Nazis abused the new technology for propaganda purposes. But picture quality remained unsatisfactory. The intermediate film method served as a temporary solution. The exposed film was developed immediately in a mobile camera van and scanned with a Nipkow scanning disc. The picture was then transmitted after a delay of only 1 minute. Only a year later, the new electronic cameras were smaller and handier, and for the first time mobile too. The general public displayed a keen interest in up-to-the-minute reporting. By 1939, television technology had long since emerged from the embryo stage. The new standard now had an astonishing 441 lines per picture. Mass production was just around the corner. The Nazis attached only minor importance to the new medium. With the outbreak of war, television research was shelved all over Europe. In 1939, in the United States, the era of fully electronic television dawned. Television research there went on even during the war. 10,000 television receivers were already in private ownership. During the war, TV programs were broadcast in New York on a weekly basis. In 1945, the industrial capacity used for the production of war material was made available for the manufacture of consumer goods. The new mass medium could no longer be stopped. The film industry was still the leading entertainment medium, but with the increasing spread of television, Hollywood plunged into a crisis from which it would never totally recover. As early as 1949, the Radio Corporation of America developed fully electronic color television. Known as NTSC, the system used is still standard in the US and Japan even today. 1955 saw the first live transmission of a baseball game from the east to the west coast. Hundreds of television stations sprang up, forming a dense network throughout the country. The United States became the world's first TV nation. In Europe, television remained black and white. In 1953, the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II was transmitted live in Western Europe, a great technical undertaking. Britain's monarch thus triggered off the first TV boom in post-war Europe. 10 years later, on June the 26th, 1963, millions of viewers worldwide saw the broadcast of John F. Kennedy's famous speech in Berlin.
Ich bin ein Berliner.
The event was filmed by 40 TV cameras.